The night I lost my job, I thought I had already hit rock bottom, but I was wrong, because nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my in-laws' house and realized they were going to vote on whether I still belonged there. I stood in that living room like I was already invisible, while they sat around the dining table as if I was a problem to be solved. My husband didn't stop them. He didn't defend me. He just looked down like my life had become something too uncomfortable to touch. If this story resonates with you, please take a second to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Your city, your country, and even what time it is right now in your place in the world. I read every single one because it reminds me I'm not alone in this. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night everything I thought was stable in my life shattered in a way I could never take back. And before I tell you how I ended up in that room, I need you to understand where all of this started. It began with a single phone call that morning, the kind of call that doesn't sound like tragedy at first, just quiet corporate words that slowly erase your security one sentence at a time. I remember standing in my kitchen in Dallas, Texas, coffee still warm in my hands, when my manager told me they were restructuring and my position was no longer needed. No warning, no fight, just an ending disguised as policy. I kept saying, I understand, even though I didn't. When I hung up, the silence in the house felt heavier than the words I had just heard. My husband Daniel was supposed to be at work, but he was still home, sitting at the table with a strange expression I couldn't read. He didn't ask how the call went. He just nodded slowly, like he was waiting for something else to happen. I should have noticed that moment. I should have known that losing my job was not going to be the worst part of that day. By the afternoon, his mother Margaret called, her voice calm but sharp, asking us to come over for what she called a family discussion. That phrase should have warned me, but I still walked in thinking it was about support, about figuring things out together. Instead, I found myself standing in front of a table full of eyes that had already decided my value. Margaret didn't even wait for me to sit down. She said we needed to vote on what was best for everyone in the house moving forward. I laughed at first because I thought it was a joke, but no one else laughed. Daniel sat to my left, silent, hands folded, avoiding my eyes like I was already gone. Jessica, my sister-in-law, was the first to raise her hand, and that small movement changed everything. The air in the room shifted, and suddenly I understood this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't standing in a family home anymore. I was standing in a courtroom where I had never agreed to be judged, and I still didn't know that the decision they were about to make was only the beginning of something I would never see coming. The moment Jessica raised her hand, I felt something inside me go completely still, like my body had decided to shut down before my mind could fully process what was happening. I remember staring at her fingers in the air, so casual, so certain, as if she was voting on something as simple as what to order for dinner, not whether I still had a place to live. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched so long it felt like the house itself was waiting for me to react, to cry, to beg, to do something that would justify the decision already forming around me. But I did not move. I just stood there, feeling the weight of every glance in the room, especially Daniel's, who still refused to look at me directly. That hurt more than anything Margaret could have said, because silence from the person you trust the most always sounds like agreement. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice calm but cold, saying this was not personal, just a practical decision about stability. She said the word stability like I was the one who had disrupted it, like losing my job had turned me into a problem that needed to be removed. I wanted to laugh again, but nothing came out. Instead, I heard myself ask a question I did not even plan. Are you seriously voting on me like this? My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Robert, Daniel's father, cleared his throat and looked away, avoiding the question entirely, which somehow felt like another vote against me. Jessica leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and said I needed to understand the situation from their perspective, that I was no longer contributing the way I used to. That word contributing landed harder than anything else, because it reduced everything I had been, everything I had done, into a single measurement of usefulness. Daniel finally shifted in his seat, but only to adjust his posture, not to speak. That was when I realized something terrifying, not that they were against me, but that they had already rehearsed this conversation without me. I was not part of the discussion. I was the subject of it. I looked at Daniel again, searching for something, anything, even hesitation, but all I found was exhaustion, like he had already accepted the outcome before I even walked into the room. My hands started to tremble slightly, so I folded them together to hide it, pressing my fingers so tightly they hurt just to stay grounded. Margaret asked if anyone had objections, and the way she said it made it clear she did not expect any. No one raised their voice. No one defended me. Even the air felt like it had chosen a side. I remember thinking how strange it was that a house full of people could feel more empty than standing alone in a parking lot at midnight. That was when I noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. Daniel kept checking his phone under the table, as if waiting for a message, as if this moment was scheduled, and he was only here to confirm it was going according to plan. My chest tightened, not from anger yet, but from the slow realization that I was the only person in that room who had not been preparing for this. Margaret finally said it, the words that turned everything from uncomfortable to irreversible, that maybe it was time for me to consider other living arrangements. She did not say leave, but everyone heard it anyway. I looked around the table one more time, at faces that had once smiled at me during holidays, birthdays, ordinary dinners, and now could not meet my eyes. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet clarity that I would later understand changed everything. I stopped asking for permission in my mind. I stopped waiting for someone to save me from this moment. Because somewhere between Jessica's raised hand and Daniel's silence, I realized this was not the beginning of my downfall. It was the beginning of something they had no idea I was already preparing for, and none of them were ready for what I was about to do next. After I stepped out of that room, the air outside the house felt strangely colder, even though it was a warm Texas evening and the sun was still hanging low over the neighborhood streets. I stood on the front porch for a moment, my hands still trembling slightly as I gripped my purse strap, listening to the faint sound of conversation continuing behind the closed door, like nothing had just happened to me. It was the sound of a decision being finalized without my presence, like my life had just been discussed and archived in a meeting I was no longer invited to attend. I told myself to breathe, slowly, carefully, like I had learned to do in moments when everything inside me wanted to break at once. My phone vibrated in my hand, but I did not look at it immediately. Instead, I walked down the steps of the house one by one, feeling each step like a separation from something I had once called home. When I finally reached my car parked along the curb, I sat inside without starting the engine, just staring forward through the windshield as if waiting for my mind to catch up with what had just happened. That was when I opened the message. It was from a recruiter I had spoken to weeks earlier, someone I had almost forgotten about because life had been too stable, too predictable, too safe. The message was simple, asking if I was still interested in a senior operations role in San Francisco, with a relocation package and immediate onboarding if I was available. I remember reading it twice, not because I did not understand it, but because it felt like it had arrived at the exact moment everything else in my life was being taken away. My hands slowly stopped shaking as I read it again. There was a clarity in that moment that I did not expect, like two timelines of my life had collided, one where I stayed and fought for a place in a house that no longer wanted me, and one where I simply left and rebuilt everything from nothing. I did not reply right away, but I saved the message, my thumb hovering over the screen longer than it should have. Inside the house behind me, I could still hear faint movement, chairs shifting, someone pouring a drink, the normal rhythm of a family that had already moved on from me emotionally before I had even fully left physically. I thought about Daniel again, about the way he had avoided my eyes, and something inside me finally settled into a decision that felt less like anger and more like acceptance. I was not going to argue my way back into a room that had already voted me out. I started the car, but I did not drive home. Instead, I drove toward a small coffee shop a few miles away, the one I used to go to when I needed to think. The road felt longer than usual, like my entire sense of direction had changed in a single evening. When I arrived, I sat by the window with a plain black coffee in front of me, staring at the traffic outside while the world continued as if nothing important had just shifted. I finally replied to the recruiter with a single sentence saying I was interested and ready to move forward. My finger paused before I hit send, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that this was the moment everything would begin to change. At that same time, back in that house, I knew they were probably still discussing me, still deciding what my absence would look like in their daily life, still believing they had control over the outcome. What they did not know was that the version of me who walked out of that room was not the same person who had walked in. And somewhere between that vote and this quiet coffee shop, I had already started becoming someone they would no longer recognize, someone who was no longer asking to stay. The coffee in front of me had gone cold before I even realized I had been staring at the same spot on the window for nearly 20 minutes. Watching people pass by like nothing in my life had just been rewritten without my consent. My phone lay face up on the table, the recruiter's message still glowing faintly, as if it was waiting for me to confirm that I was no longer the same woman who had walked into that house earlier that evening. I finally picked it up again, not because I had changed my mind, but because I needed proof that this was real, that somewhere outside of that house, my life still had options. I opened the email thread again and read every detail carefully. The salary, the relocation support, the start date, the benefits, all of it feeling unreal in contrast to what I had just experienced. It was not just a job offer. It felt like a door that had been quietly waiting for me while I was busy trying to survive inside a place that no longer wanted me. I remember the exact moment I decided to ask for a call. My fingers moved before my hesitation could catch up, and I scheduled a video meeting for the next morning at 9. When I pressed confirm, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that I was no longer waiting for permission from anyone. I left the coffee shop shortly after, driving back toward a small apartment I had rented years ago but rarely used since moving in with Daniel. It still had a spare key under the mat, untouched, as if time itself had been waiting for me to return. Inside, the space felt unfamiliar but safe, like a memory that had not yet been corrupted by disappointment. I sat on the edge of the couch, took off my shoes, and finally allowed myself to breathe without the weight of other people's expectations pressing on my chest. My phone rang once that night, and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time before letting it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message. That silence told me everything I needed to know. The next morning came too quickly, sunlight slipping through the blinds before I felt ready for it. I prepared for the video call carefully, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I needed to remind myself that I still had control over something in my life. When the recruiter appeared on screen, everything he said felt like a continuation of the possibility I had already begun to accept. He spoke about growth, relocation, leadership, and stability, words that now carried a different weight than they had ever held before. I answered calmly, asking the questions I needed, listening more than I spoke, feeling a strange sense of detachment from the version of me who had sat in that family meeting the night before. After the call ended, I did not immediately celebrate. Instead, I sat in silence, watching my reflection faintly appear in the dark screen of my laptop, and I realized something important. I had not been waiting for a better life to find me. I had simply been waiting for the courage to leave the one that no longer recognized my value. Later that afternoon, I received another message from Daniel asking if I would come back to talk things through. The words were polite, careful, almost rehearsed, but they no longer reached the part of me that used to respond automatically. I read it once, then placed my phone face down on the table. Outside, the world kept moving normally, cars passing, people laughing, life continuing as if nothing had shifted. But inside me, everything had already moved far beyond the point of return. And what I did not yet tell anyone was that by the time they had finished deciding whether I belonged in their home, I had already begun building a life where I would never need their permission again. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I expected, not because I had slept well, but because my mind no longer knew how to stay in the same emotional place for too long. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence of that house, not heavy or judgmental, but open, like it was waiting for me to decide what kind of life would exist inside it. I made coffee without thinking, standing barefoot in the kitchen, watching the steam rise as if it belonged to someone else's routine. For the first time in a long time, no one was asking me for anything. No one was evaluating me. No one was deciding my value around a table. At 9 o'clock sharp, I opened my laptop and joined the video call. The recruiter appeared on screen with a calm professionalism that felt almost distant compared to the emotional chaos of the past 48 hours. He walked through final details again, but I was only half listening, because my attention kept drifting to the idea that this conversation was not about permission, it was about transition. When he asked if I was ready to proceed with formal acceptance, I paused for just a second longer than necessary, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that once I said yes, nothing in my life would remain the same. I said yes. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything I had said in that house for years. After the call ended, I did not feel excitement in the way people usually describe it. Instead, I felt a strange stillness, like a door had closed behind me without sound, and another had already opened ahead. Later that afternoon, I received another message from Daniel. This time it was longer. He said the family meeting had gotten out of hand, that Margaret was stressed, that Jessica did not mean what she said, and that we should talk before I made any decisions I could not take back. I read it slowly, not because I was confused, but because I was noticing how language changes when people realize they are losing control. There was no mention of the vote, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just soft phrases trying to pull me back into a version of reality where nothing had crossed a line. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat on the edge of the couch and thought about every moment I had been slowly disappearing in that house long before that night. The interruptions when I spoke, the decisions made without me, the way silence had become a language I was expected to accept. By evening, I finally replied with only one sentence saying I needed time and space. I did not explain further. I did not argue. I simply stepped back from the conversation, the same way I had stepped out of that room. That night, I went for a walk alone around the neighborhood, passing houses where lights were turning on, where families were sitting down for dinner, where life continued in its ordinary rhythm. For the first time, I was not comparing myself to any of it. I was just observing. My phone buzzed again, but I let it ring in my pocket. Somewhere between the sidewalk and the quiet streetlight at the corner, I realized something I had been avoiding thinking about. I was no longer trying to be included in their decision. I was already living inside a different one. And what they still did not understand was that the version of me they had voted on no longer existed in the same way it had that night, because while they were deciding whether I could stay, I had already begun the process of leaving them behind completely. In the days after everything changed, life did not suddenly become perfect or easy, but it became quiet in a way that I had not felt in a long time. I woke up each morning in a small apartment that finally felt like it belonged only to me, not to expectations, not to silent judgments, not to decisions made around tables I was never truly invited to. There was no more waiting for someone else to define my place in the world. There was only space, and in that space, I slowly began to hear myself again. The job offer became real shortly after. I moved forward with the relocation, and even though leaving Texas felt like tearing a piece of my life away, it also felt like finally stepping into air that I could breathe without permission. Daniel tried to reach out a few more times. His messages softened, became more reflective, sometimes even emotional, but something in me had already settled. Not from anger, but from clarity. I understood then that love without respect eventually becomes silence in a room full of people deciding your worth. I did not hate them. I simply could no longer return to a place where I had been reduced to a vote. In California, I rebuilt slowly. My days were not dramatic or cinematic. They were simple. Work, walks in the evening, learning how to sit with myself without feeling like I needed to justify my existence. And in that simplicity, I found something I had never truly known before. Stability that was not dependent on approval. One night, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights stretch into the distance, and I thought about that evening at the table, about how quietly everything had shifted without anyone realizing they were no longer in control of the story they thought they owned. I realized something important in that moment. Most people do not lose their power in loud ways. They lose it in silence, when someone they underestimated finally stops asking to be understood. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt small in a room where you should have been valued, I want you to hear me clearly. You do not need to earn a place in spaces where your presence is already questioned. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's comfort. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply leave, not in anger, but in clarity. There is something almost spiritual about the moment you stop waiting for validation and start trusting your own direction. I do believe now that life has a way of gently removing you from places where you are no longer meant to grow, even when it hurts at first. And if you are in that space right now, unsure and quietly breaking inside, I want you to know you are not alone. I have been there. I know what it feels like to sit in silence while others decide your value. But I also know what it feels like to rebuild, slowly, one decision at a time, until your life finally feels like yours again. Be careful with where you place your trust. Protect your peace like it is something sacred, because it is. Listen to that quiet voice inside you that speaks before fear or doubt can drown it out. Some people will call it instinct, some will call it faith. I now believe it is both. And if you are still here listening, I just want to say thank you for sharing this moment with me. Thank you for holding space for this story. If it touched something inside you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply share where you are in the world. It means more than you know. And if you want to continue walking through stories like this, subscribe so we can keep finding our way through the silence together. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let a place that does not value you decide your worth.